Hello, this is Dr. Stanley Williams. Welcome to an overview of emergency public health events and community responses. This is from the course of Trauma and Community Crisis. It's part of the executive leadership of mental health and human services. Let's get into the objectives. This is very relevant given some of the challenges we've had as a nation and within the entire world with pandemics, natural disasters such as hurricanes and flooding and so forth. And so this really is an important course that's going to help you as an administrator to know your role with mental health agencies or your leadership within the community, with working with populations, with people with disabilities and high-risk populations. So in the course, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of emergency public health, how it affects society and people. We're going to describe some of those natural disaster regions that are in the area. We want to go into what are the 4 phases of the disaster cycle. This is really important in terms of preparation for how you're going to be able to engage as a leader in the community crises that affect the public. We're going to describe some of the legislative efforts associated with disaster responses and identify resources and guides for disaster planning. So within the disasters and public health emergencies, when you think about it, there's the natural disasters and there's disasters caused by human beings, and there's public health emergencies. And so everything from hurricanes and flooding, no notice events that may be like earthquakes and human-caused disasters, and then the public health emergencies associated with pandemic and influenza. That's important to have that framework in your mind as you go forth and begin to show leadership of how to respond to these types of events for your agency and for the community. Because these types of events cause some real serious disruptions in power communications. If you're a provider of mental health services and have like a residential treatment program, if your power is not there, what are you going to do? Do you need to evacuate your people? First responders are going to be involved with the disaster, and so you may not be able to call upon them like if there's a crisis within your service delivery. And so you must be able, as a community-based organization, to have a plan to deal with those disasters. It's really required, in terms of the ethical component of that, to be able to provide the right service and engagement responses to these different types of events. So when you think about the emotional strain of disasters and evacuations, I remember living in Savannah, Georgia, and this was a local television station that was just showing how folks were evacuating from the coast. And I grew up in, Ohio, and came into sort of the east coast of Savannah, and it was just alarming that they actually shut down the roadways from one area to actually evacuate a whole population of people. And so when you think about that I-95 corridor, leaving southeast part of the country, they were trying to move northward away from the hurricane impact. And it's very challenging, when you think about it. You have to pack up all your important goods, personal items, your family. It just creates a lot of chaos and emotional distress. And so that's important to understand as a leader when you're trying to evacuate maybe a residential treatment program, plus you have staff that have to care for their family. So it creates a lot of confusion. That's why you have to have a well thought out plan. And you think about the aftermath, of these disasters and the human suffering and how tremendous losses occur from human life to personal items to people's homes. That doesn't even address some of the issues where employment, some businesses went out of business in terms of being able to stay afloat, and because the building was destroyed. So what does that mean for the employees? And so there's some real challenges with that. And so you need to be able to tap into not only a plan, but resources in the community. It's important to know about, where you live and the possibility of some of these things occurring. And so this is an interesting map that kind of have shown kind of the historic pictures of the kind of things that have happened, all the way from in Galveston, where 1900 in the year 1900, 8,000 people died, and across the country, virtually every state has had some type of traumatic event from a natural disaster. When you think about the dollars, billions of dollars, related to weather, not only from hurricanes, from hailstones, to all kind of tornado events, flooding, that's really disruptive to the life of families and communities. There's different regions that actually have a higher propensity of different types of storm damage and so forth. And you can just imagine, as far as this region 6, as far as the Texas area and Oklahoma and Arkansas, from severe storms and flooding and so forth. And then you talk about region 4, which is the sort of the southeast. And so the weather has really impacted a lot of different parts of the country. And depending on that part of the country, there's greater risk for certain things. So the disaster cycle, this is really important, and it's part of in your mind to be able to have a response to these types of events. And so the first part is preparation. You have to have a plan, and then you have to be able to respond to that plan. And then there's a recovery, and then mitigation, trying to prevent future disasters, or minimizing the effects of what has occurred, if it's a pandemic and so forth. And so this 4-phase disaster cycle is really kind of the standard of how to address some of these types of events. So historically, back in 2006, in the wake of Katrina, that had a lot of devastating impact on the nation, the federal government identified, that they need to create some structures within the federal government to support local communities. And one of those was the in 2006, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act. From that also, in 2011, the president developed a national preparedness goal to strengthen the security of our nation from natural disasters and public emergencies. And it tasked the Department of Homeland Security to coordinate with other federal agencies, um, in in particular FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to develop, through the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, ASPR, a mission to save lives. So this is the main coordinating group, ASPR, ASPR, that is tasked really to support local communities and states from the federal framework. When you think about how to respond within these tragic events, there's very vulnerable populations and at-risk populations. You think about children, people living in institutional settings. You may be in charge of one or administrating in an institutional setting. Older adults, pregnant women, people with disabilities, not only people with mental illness, but folks that have physical disabilities, chronic illnesses. Think about in terms of being able to get access to your medications for chronic health or for psychiatric situations. And then you have issues of folks with limited speaking, English speaking, and need the resources for interpreters. And so then you have folks who are homeless. And so there's a priority list that's based on kind of this framework that ASPR developed. It's really important to understand these types of resources and how you can define your community in terms of a population health need. So part of the ASPR response resources is they have regional emergency coordinators. These will be your point of contacts to help you conduct your planning and to be part of the community planning to respond to these types of events. Then you have the National Disaster Medical System. This is very critical in terms of the patient care, being able to look at those that need hospitalization. Also, there's veterinary services associated with animals and so forth. And then you have the emergency prescription assistance. This is really important for folks who don't have insurance that need to have access to their prescription drugs and medical supplies for their disabilities. So within that framework, ASPR, they also have developed in coordination with the Homeland Security are these different types of pamphlets that'll really be useful um, for you to respond in those emergency situations. Um, like the National Response Framework, this is a very important um, item that should be used in your planning. It helps you develop your role, the structure in the community. It talks about how to deal with issues related to protecting your property in these types of events. Part of the ASPR is how they define emergency support functions, everything from transportation to communications, firefighting. Then you have the issue of search and rescue. I want to talk a little bit about the mass care and emergency assistance and temporary housing because that's very crucial for those with disabilities and vulnerable populations. And then also the public health and medical services. So with the mass care, it's very important to identify shelters beforehand. A lot of agencies work with hospitals that are further inland, away from certain hazards when you talk about hurricanes, where they have other relationships with other types of entities to be able to develop shelters. This is an area of partnerships, even with churches. Churches have large spaces that can be used to congregate shelters. They also may have kitchens and so forth to help with feeding. And so it's really important in terms of developing those partnerships in the community for that types of housing. And then you have the public health and medical services that are very important to deal with the issues of drugs and medical devices and the idea of like if there's a need for patient care, behavioral health care, all of that is done within the public health and medical services ESF. Here's another area in terms of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. This is again by the Homeland Security through ASPR. It talks about the coordinating of the structures, how to restore and develop and revitalize the community, and helps you define principles. So there's like within ASPR also these 9 core capabilities from public health to behavioral health, food and safety. There may be some needs for long-term health issues where responders can help support that and locate even from other states with the federal approach. And then the issues of children in disaster. When we think about these types of events, you talk about post-traumatic stress and some other psychiatric crises that can develop from the stress and anxiety associated with these events. So some of the partners that are very important in this engagement to be able to support communities and local efforts are from the federal standpoint with FEMA, Department of Defense, VA, and then you have the American Red Cross and other organizations that are really poised as part of the ASPR response to have these partners to cover all aspects of a person's lived experiences to support their needs. And then when you think about the impacts of weather, on the left top, it talks about how climate impacts the medical, physical, emotional aspects of folks, where folks have, um, low tolerance of stress, and they're may get aggressive in terms of their response to, having so much change in their lives. Um, and then you have some of the issues related to how heat and so forth can affect everything from your physical um, concerns if you have like COPD or some type of asthma. And then on the right side, it talks about some of the other drivers, the exposure drivers, in terms of not having access to mental health services. And we call that some of the social determinants of health, or the pre-existing mental health issues, and then being exposed to these type of events can really increase the trajectory of illness, or make those illnesses worse. When you think about at-risk populations, just consider children, older adults, pregnant women, people with disabilities. And so ASPR's really identified, a plan for that. But it's important that federal um, partners can only do so much. There has to be local planning of everything from shelters to medications, all those needs. And once you have a plan, you can then begin to work with the federal government to help augment some of the needs that are missing. So part of the planning, when you look at the at-risk groups, the CDC has really developed opportunities to look at vulnerability. And so this is a vulnerability index that kind of looks at those high-risk populations and be able to define by population health approach in terms of your community and mapping. So this is another resource from the Center of Disease Control, CDC. This additional component of CDC also looks at what I mentioned was those special needs populations by looking at developing coalitions, disaster assessment teams. It's critical for you to be part of that disaster assessment team on a local level so that you can speak to the needs of folks with disabilities, and being a leader and being able to identify some of those unmet needs that has to be dealt with, like shelters. And then also, you don't want to put folks in institutions if you can look at other placements. That's important, given the nature of some of the mental illnesses. When you consider about, this holistic approach, you have to look at, this is something come from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. It talks about the 8 dimensions of wellness. And this is really important to kind of understand the holistic approach. When you kind of understand about the emotional, financial, social, spiritual, occupational, physical, and intellectual needs of people and environmental, if you know that in the beginning, and if that is part of some of your guiding principles, then you're able to identify those same 8 dimensions that are impacted by disaster response. And so it's really important to coordinate with people and the knowledge base of that for folks to really grasp, what is the impact on people on those different dimensions. And with that, I just want to thank you. This is a great opportunity with your leadership to be able to impact the community, help save lives, to mitigate damage on an emotional level, and to be able to respond in a coherent way with the proper planning with these types of resources. Thank you very much.